Hi, uh, uh, I'm Richard, and welcome to the 82nd in our series on Middle Eastern Islamic history. Today, we're going to talk about the Republic of Turkey, sort of picking up where we left off last week on İnönü, Menderes, and the Second Republic. Now, just for clarity's sake, the terms First Republic, Second Republic, and Third Republic with respect to Turkey refer to the constitution that was in place during each of those republics. And so every time you get a new constitution, you get a new republic. That's sort of, and we'll go into some of those important distinctions as we get through this. The rules, for those of you who are not familiar, this is not an academic presentation. I'm not accredited by any institution in the study of religion, politics, philosophy, or history. This is my perspective coming as a layperson. That said, I want to try and keep this as a secular presentation, commenting on the political phenomena from an objective and set-aside point of view. And of course, this is considering political situations that still have an impact on people today, so let us be respectful of the topic. That said, I love interactivity. Questions, comments, clarifications, please put those in the chat. I do read the chat and will respond to the questions in real time. Alternatively, at the end of 2 hours, I will have a Q&A period, and you can either write your question then, or I will unmute you, and you can ask your question then. I also like to say that these presentations are a 101 and a 201. A 101 meaning that if you don't know much about the region, I'll catch you up. And a 201 meaning that if you already know something about the history that I'm going to tell you, I'll probably tell you things you didn't know. I also like to say that there's going to be a 2-hour hard stop, meaning that whatever I don't cover today will roll over into next week, which is perfect because next week is going to be the Third Republic. So if that happens, yeah, it'll just roll into next week and we will go to the Q&A period. If I put dates below a person, if it's a political figure, it's usually their dates of service and their most important role. If they're a thought leader but never actually held a political position, that's usually the years of their life. This is going to be recorded, so you can watch it later, along with the other 81 episodes of the Middle Eastern History series, which you can see on our YouTube page. Please subscribe to our YouTube page in order to see all of our updated videos. And watch them at your leisure. Additionally, you can see any of the other series that are put on by History Mostly Ancient Discussions, which is the group of which I am a part. And if you want to be advised when our meetings are occurring, please join our meetup. There are other meetups where you may be able to find some of our events, but all of our events at History Mostly Ancient will be in this meetup group. So please join if you want to see more of our events. And of course, we have premium YouTube, premium Zoom, and premium Meetup, all of which cost us a premium. So to the extent that you can help us, we'd really appreciate both PayPal donations or buying a coffee. And we will continue to offer these presentations at no cost. But if you feel motivated, we want to provide those links for your use. All right. So we've discussed previously that upon entering World War I, the Ottoman Empire, which was a multi-ethnic, pluricentric empire, was taken apart by the Allied powers. And part of the process that led to it being taken apart was that the Ottoman Empire, number one, would be dismembered, right? All of the Middle Eastern regions became their own mandates, as we've discussed in a number of the other presentations. And Anatolia itself would be part of an occupied Ottoman Empire that was basically doing the whim of the Entente powers, that is, Britain and France. Primarily, the United States was taking a more isolationist view in the post-World War I situation. Now, when Atatürk led his war against the Entente powers, especially Greece acting on their behalf in Western Anatolia, he not only had to fight off the Greeks in the west, the French in the south, and the Armenians in the northeast, but he also had to overthrow the Ottoman government itself. And so the government that he created was a new entity that didn't see a necessarily direct correlation with the Ottoman Empire. And so a lot of those notions of pluricentrism, of empire, sort of go out the way in Mustafa Kemal's vision of what this new country should be. And those visions are encapsulated in his Altı Ok, or his 6 arrows, which define his political philosophy, which of course has been named after him as Kemalism. So he abandoned the concept of empire with his idea of cumhuriyetçilik, or republicanism, that the country should be a republic. And in fact, he dismembered the both the imperial aspects of the Ottoman Empire by getting rid of the emperor, and the religious aspects of the empire by getting rid of the caliph, in order to create a republic that was purely secular in nature. And that secularity is in that 5th arrow, laiklik, or secularism, the idea that the Turkish Republic would not have any religion as a guiding principle of the affairs of its people. Now, we should contrast the form of secularism that we see in Atatürk's First Republic with the secularism that is most commonly understood in most Western countries, which is the idea that the state and the religious views of the people shall be entirely separate, so that the state doesn't have any power to limit or expand religion, and religion doesn't have any power to co-opt the state. In Atatürk's vision, religion is actually a subordinate entity to the state. So the state actually has a religious ministry which publishes the sermons that are to be used. And also, for example, Atatürk in the 1920s required all of the adhan, which is the call to prayer, to be performed in Turkish as opposed to the traditional Arabic, right? So you have a direct state control of religion. The next sort of value was, instead of this pluricentric empire, right, of multiple ethnicities, he begins this idea of milliyetçilik, of national identityism or nationalism, where the people of Turkey are Turks. And this becomes a huge idea within the concept of Turkey, that not only are the members of the Republic of Turkey Turkish citizens, but they are now ethnically Turks. And so we saw during Republican Party policy, Cumhuriyet Halk Partisi, CHP, is the Republican Party. Although we should be careful that we're not comparing these terms to American terms, because we will also have the Democratic Party, but that is not, or the Democrat Party, but that is not in relation to the American Democratic Party either. So this Republican Party, their political philosophy in the 1930s is that even Muslim minorities that had come into Turkey as muhajir, as immigrants, their identities were false, and in truth, they were Turks. And they left the language ambiguous as to whether that is an ethnic claim or a national claim. But when you read their policy saying that Circassianism, Pomakism, that these things are lies, that these ethnic identities are lies, so much more is it the case that Turkish identity is an ethnic character. And of course, we see this most prominently in their policy towards the Kurds, where they consider the Kurds to be mountain Turks, ignoring their historic identity of speaking a different language, of being from a different culture, and organizing themselves according to different religious principles, in many cases, than the Turkish population. Some cases, it's just more religious, right? They might be Sunnis who are more pious, or in other cases, they might be of other religious minorities, like the Alevis. We also have this idea of devletçilik, which becomes a defining economic policy of the Atatürk period. And devletçilik is this idea of a state directed capitalism, that the government is going to heavily invest in industry, choose winners and losers, and create banks to facilitate the growth of a modern economy. This is fundamentally distinct from, for example, a laissez-faire economic system where the state takes no action, or a communist system where everything is planned in the economy, essentially planned economy. So there is a marketplace, people are allowed to open and close businesses, but at the same time, the state is taking a disproportionate role in the direction and organization of the economy. The last one of these values, and we're going to see it recur during this period, is what's called devrimcilik, or inkılapçılık. Both of these are two terms for the same thing, or revolutionism. Atatürk believed that his Republican philosophy was revolutionary in nature, that it would have to keep undergoing large-scale systematic changes in order to progress as the Turkish people needed to progress. And the old history and the old ideas needed to be burned in the pursuit of a better, more westernized future for Turkey. So these were things that led to changes in people's clothing, changes in the calendar, changes in a number of different local laws, and whether people could veil or not in public. All these ideas were designed to erase the past and create a new, modern, progressive Turkish identity. Now, one thing that Atatürk had tried to do during the First Republic period was he tried to create an opposition party. So one of the parties he tried to create was with Fethi Okyar, which created the Liberal Republican Party. But that party, at a critical juncture, was not supported by Atatürk when it needed his help the most. Atatürk claimed he would be impartial and let the party run on its own merits. But he eventually backtracked, which effectively meant that any opposition to Atatürk's principles and philosophies could not be expressed as long as he lived. Some other possibilities were when Kazım Karabekir, a celebrated general during the Turkish War of Independence, and also we should discuss his negative attribute that he also was responsible for the persecution of Armenians during the War of Independence, created his own progressive Republican Party, which was also shut down by Mustafa Kemal, because he was afraid that these other parties might introduce elements that go against the 6 major arrows, and therefore would be in direct opposition to the fundamental changes that he wished to make to the Turkish society as a whole. And of course, as we mentioned, during the First Republic period, there were revolts against Atatürk's rule, primarily coming from groups that did not feel that his values in the 6 arrows represented their values from a historical basis. And probably the most famous of these was the Sheikh Said revolt, which was a revolt by ethnic Kurds who were more religious and therefore objected both to the milliyetçilik, the idea that they were all Turks, and objected to the idea of laiklik, of secularism, because they were religious, and religion had become a part of their daily lives. So during the Republic period, Atatürk had soldiers surround their historic territories, besiege them, and of course, since he had the power of aircraft, whereas these rebels did not, he was able to bomb their positions as well. This led, of course, to the darkest stain during Atatürk's rule, which was his attack at Dersim in 1937, where he killed where his soldiers killed in a massacre men, women, and children of Kurdish ancestry in order to put down the revolt there. And in line with his views on milliyetçilik and laiklik, you had the religious marginalization and secularized schools that were designed to deprive them of their religion. And of course, their culture was deracinated. They were deported from, a number of them were deported from certain villages they owned. Their language was not legal or official for either personal use or public use. And their lands were expropriated in many circumstances. And then, of course, we have the personality cult that is associated around Atatürk. And this is one of the more interesting things. Atatürk, of course, cultivated his own personality cult, but the majority of the cult that exists today is not Atatürk's himself, but a creation of those who came afterward. And one of the points, and I'll sort of come back to it periodically, is that those who have typically invested the most in promoting a culture around Atatürk are explicitly those whose policies differed in certain noticeable ways from Atatürk himself. And this is very much in style of, bathing yourself in the flag when your policies may seem objectionable or undesirable. We can think about this from both, from an American perspective as well. right? For example, the violation of civil rights that came with the Patriot Act was clothed in, are you not patriotic to America and American defense, rather than a discussion about the merits or lack thereof of the particular deprivations of civil liberties. There's a question, was Atatürk's theoretical interest in an opposition party based more on a desire for apparent legitimacy, but he didn't really have the time or temperament for trying to truly negotiate that legitimacy? I think Atatürk's dream was for the Turkish people to be able to be self-governing. And his view was that, of course, there should be no foreign empire that controls Turkey. Turkey should not be partitioned by the British or the French or the Italians, as was considered during the Treaty of Sèvres. It should be ruled by Turks. But the problem, of course, is that how will Turks be able to rule themselves? Well, he follows after the Western democratic tradition, but at the same time realizes that that tradition requires an opposition, that requires other people to be involved in that process. So you have this weird situation where he knows that there needs to be a cultivation of a political culture, that Turks need to be invested in the creation of their own political destiny in order for this Western-style system to work. But at the same time, he wants the people who are invested to already agree with him, just not be in his party. And we're actually going to see that a lot of the other political parties that do develop are sort of cast-offs of Kemalism. But Mustafa Kemal was sort of stuck between these two realities, that he couldn't have a political party that agreed with him on everything that wasn't his party, but that he needed an opposition political party to create an investment by the people in the process of politicization and civic engagement. It's a really great question. So I just want to discuss a little bit, though, about what Atatürk's personality cult has sort of become. The first aspect of it is that his values are seen independently of him as a person. And this is one of the interesting things, because Atatürk definitely ruled in his republic from an autocratic perspective. And in fact, some of the laws that he used were lifted right out of fascist Italy, for want of a better term. But Atatürk was approaching politics from a top-down perspective. He was going to create the Turkish people. He was going to create a Turkish society, as opposed to the fascists, who were capitalizing on an existing political movement for an authoritarian leader who would create all the social reforms that they needed. And so Atatürk, in many ways, seems like, in the best way of understanding it, the white man's burden type of a person, where he goes in and sees the people in a dilapidated state, and he is trying to improve them and bring them along the road to civilization. And so a lot of the personality cult derives from current Turkish people who see how he saved the country, looking back on that process of leading them towards modernity in a positive light, that without him, they would not have advanced. Without his vision, they would not have moved forward. And so you have a lot of quotes from him that are about intellect. For example, my moral heritage is science and reason, referring to the idea that the secularism of the Republic was what saved it from the backwardness of the religious Ottoman Empire. And the other quote that we're going to see in numerous other contexts is happy is he who considers himself a Turk, which was part of the creation of a Turkish national identity. So these quotes become emblematic of him and his philosophy. But because he never, unlike the fascists, had a clear prescriptive philosophy of, in order to achieve inkılapçılık, you have to do this. And in order to achieve devrimcilik, you have to do this. And in order to achieve laiklik, you have to do this. a lot of people were able to reinterpret and reimagine Kemalism after Mustafa Kemal himself was no longer with us in 1938. So, unlike the fascism, which were contingent on specific political personalities and certain political views being either maintained or undercut, Kemalism has actually proved much more durable than these sorts of ideologies. There's a question, isn't the white man's burden from Rudyard Kipling? Yes, that is. And of course, when Rudyard Kipling was using it, he was using it from the perspective that the English would go to countries like India. Rudyard Kipling was thinking of India, and bring the Indian savages, quote unquote, into modernity. The difference, of course, in Atatürk's case, is that this was done by him to his own people. So now the natural successor to Atatürk was İnönü. There had been some falling out between him and İnönü in 1937, as Atatürk began to take other advisors. But it was pretty clear in 1938 that İnönü would succeed Atatürk. And you can see him at nearly every major action that was performed by Atatürk's government, be it the involvement in the Turkish War of Independence, his presence in London his presence in Lausanne to sign the treaty on Turkey's behalf, the 10th year anniversary of Republic Day, all of these kinds of things. And so İnönü was in a unique position because he wanted to continue what Atatürk had done. He believed in the 6 arrows, but at the same time, he realized that he would never have Atatürk's reputation. He would never be the person who Atatürk was, because he simply didn't have that sort of character. And so he declares himself the Milli Chef, the national leader, and takes on many of the dictatorial powers that Atatürk had starting in 1938. Now, he was able to create this one-party state using a number of effective deputies. One of these, of course, is Hasan Ali Yücel, who created the Village Institutes, which was an educational facility in order to make more Turks literate, more Turks integrated into the state. We have to understand that during this period, between 1938 and 1945, when İnönü is directly in power under the First Republic, that one-party system, over 85% of the Turkish population lived outside of cities. So while Atatürk was building this modern Turkey in the cities of Ankara, Istanbul, Izmir, and so on, Edirne, fewer than 1% of all the villages, and by villages we're talking about any inhabited area of less than 10,000 people, only 1% of the villages had electricity by the time of 1945. You can imagine literacy was also lower. And so you had this situation where, as long as it was a one-party state, as long as power was concentrated in the Cumhuriyet Halk Partisi, the Republican Party, the Republican People's Party, the reforms could continue to be implemented. The economy could continue to be centralized with devletçilik, right? The country could move forward from a Western perspective. But that, of course, was cut short if there was actually going to be a democratic transition. There's a question: was Atatürk something about an identity visionary rather than a philosophical thought leader? I would say that there was something of both of those things. He was definitely the creator of a Turkish identity. The idea of a Turk wasn't really crystallized until he came around. And today, the entire friction over whether a Turk is an ethnic term or a citizenship term is a direct result of what he was doing through the creation of the idea of a Turk. So I think in a lot of ways, the Turkish identity in both a national and ethnic sense owes a lot to him. In terms of his political philosophy, it comes into these general brackets of ideas and a number of quotes on them, but it's not like he published a book on like how to Atatürk. Here are the 6 stages. Each of these things that people will impute to him all of the quotes that are said to him did happen, but they happened in specific contexts. And so it's almost in many ways the creation of a exegetical tradition of all of Atatürk said all these different things. Which things are you going to pick out? And an exegetical tradition, like anybody who is familiar with the Bible would know, right? You can read whatever you want to a certain degree. There's certain things you can't read into a text, but there's a significant amount of flexibility in terms of what you can read into all these different quotes, all these different time periods, all these different occasions in order to get Atatürk to say the thing that you want. And one of the things, for example, that people talk about with Erdogan, right, is that he'll quote things of Atatürk from when he was a military leader in the Turkish War of Independence, because that's the vision of Atatürk that he wants to promote. The idea of Atatürk as a war leader, not as a secularizer, because he opposes the secularization aspect of Turkey. So this it's a lot more flexible in terms of how do you approach him. So during World War II, Turkey was in a very awkward situation. It had to build up its military significantly as a deterrent to both the Nazis and the Western powers. And as we talked about 2 weeks ago, Turkey oscillated back and forth between feigning allegiance to the West and feigning allegiance to the Nazis in order to keep itself entirely neutral. And most commentators think İnönü did a great job in terms of keeping Turkey out of World War II. One of the ironies, of course, is that in order to promote the feigned alliance with one side or the other, there became ideological outgrowths of supporting one side or the other. So, for example, when İnönü supported the Nazis, a number of irredentist nationalists came forward. These were individuals who were more extreme than İnönü and the party were in terms of how the country should orient itself as a Turkish country. And they were more extreme in two different senses. The first one is that they wanted to expand the number of governmental positions that were not available to non-Muslims. Now, of course, the Turkish population, if you count the Alevis as Muslim, which many of these ultranationalists did not, but the laws of Turkey did, was over 95% Muslim. There was not a significant non-Muslim minority in the country. Most of the Greeks had been sent to Greece in the 1923 population exchange. Most of the Armenians, for obvious reasons, were no longer in the country. Most of the Jews, especially as we get towards the end of the Holocaust, were seeking, the period in Europe, were seeking a way through Turkey to get out of the country, and combine that with the Farlek Vergisi, which we talked about last time, the wealth tax of 1943. There weren't significant minorities of non-Muslims in Turkey. But these groups, who are called Turanists, believe that only Muslim Turks should hold positions in the government. And some positions were excluded to the minorities, but not all of them were. So that was the first point of divergence. The second, and perhaps more important, is that they believed that the Turks were part of the Great Turan nation, meaning that all of the different Turkic-speaking peoples who originate in Central Siberia and through most of the stands where people speak a Turkish language, the Turkic language, which is not Turkish itself, but a close relative. Think in the way that the Romance languages are related to one another. And that all these Turkic peoples should, in truth, be under one authority. Now, this works out fine when your opponent is, when your ally is Nazi Germany, and Nazi Germany's opponent, especially in 1942, was the Soviet Union. When Turkey is beginning to notice that the Allies are increasingly looking like they're going to win, especially in 1944, the Soviet Union becomes a little more bothered by these kinds of perspectives existing within Turkey, especially as the Soviet Union has its own revanchist view that territories that used to belong to Russia in 1878, as a result of the Russo-Turkish War at that point, should be returned to the Soviet Union. Turkey, in order to preserve its neutrality, started going after these individuals, like Nihal Atsız, who you can see on the left-hand side. He and a number of these other individuals were accused of racism, in violation of the Turkish state's view on ethnic minorities and such. For the most, this is my view. I believe that the charges were primarily fabricated, in that the Turkish state, as Atsız discusses in his own defense, has its own discriminatory laws as well. They're just not as far-reaching as his are. And so their justification of putting him away has a lot more to do with political considerations than it does with the validity or invalidity of his perspective within Turkey. We also see within this period of Turanism the embracing of the idea of the wolf. There are Turkish legends that the origin of the Turkic people are with the wolves, and that's why the Turkish people are violent and expansionist. They saw both of those ideas in a positive light, that this was the power of the Turk to impress and control. And we've seen, for those who are familiar with other parts of Central Asian history, the Mongolians would say the same thing. Genghis Khan always claimed, for example, that he was descended from wolves. So this connection begins to form the origin of an idea that aggressive Turks who are defending the Turkishness of Turkey, will call themselves wolves, and we'll see that as we move through this period. So once World War II is over, Turkey is in a very unique position. As I pointed out, the Soviet Union was making claims about the expansion of both Georgia and Armenia into Turkey. Of course, Georgia and Armenia are part of the Soviet Union, but we're talking about the Soviet Socialist republics therein. And this got İnönü incredibly worried about the possibility that the Soviet Union might invade. Now, it's very important to notice that this is a fundamental change in policy. One of the things that we've discussed previously, but not today, is that the Soviet Union was actually a key helper of Turkey gain its independence against the Entente powers during the Turkish War of Independence. It was the Soviet Union that provided funding and military training to a number of the Turkish soldiers in their fights against both the French and the Greeks, and was willing to come to a peaceful resolution with them concerning the border with the Armenians. So the slow decay of Turco-Soviet relations in the late 1940s is kind of surprising in that light. In fact, Atatürk throughout his life maintained strong connections with Voroshilov, who was a Soviet attaché. So the Soviet Treaty of Friendship, which was going to be renewed in 1946, wasn't. And so Turkey decided that it needed a new benefactor. So in addition to the Soviet expansionist desires on Georgia and Armenia, the Soviet Union also wanted to control the straits, that is the Bosporus Strait and the Dardanelles Strait, which connect the Black Sea to the Aegean Sea. And of course, for the Soviet Union, control of these straits is incredibly important if it wants to move its warm water ports, like Rostov-on-Don, and of course, it controlled the ports in Ukraine as well, like Sevastopol, to get into the Mediterranean and be able to impose Soviet power externally. But in 1936, İnönü had negotiated the Montreux Convention, which basically put the straits under Turkish control, provided that during peacetime ships could transit freely, but the Turkish government could close the straits to military traffic if it so chose. And of course, the Soviet Union did not want to be in a position where the Turkish government might choose otherwise than to let its ships through. So Stalin also threatened that if he couldn't put Soviet military bases along the straits and coordinate with the Turks on when the Bosporus and the Dardanelles would be opened and closed, that he would launch an invasion. So that, combined with the demands for northeastern Turkey to be ceded to the Soviet Union, led to Turkish turns to the West, and specifically to Harry Truman, who was president of the United States in the post-war situation. Now, Truman was already allocating significant amounts of funds in what has been colloquially termed the Marshall Plan to rebuild Western Europe. The idea, of course, from the American perspective, is that an economically sufficient and functional Western Europe would be an effective American bulwark against Soviet expansion. And where better to stop Soviet expansion than the areas that were directly adjacent to the Soviet satellite states that had begun to come into existence in Eastern Europe. So Turkey was a natural fit for this kind of alliance, but it wasn't clear to Truman and others that Turkey would be the kind of country that the United States could see itself being in a long-term alliance with. The philosophy of bringing in dictators as long as they towed the Western line had not yet come into general practice at this point. And so İnönü began making changes towards democracy in a true sense, and inaugurating what is effectively a new electoral system. So in 1946, you actually had opposition parties running in Turkey for seats in the Grand National Assembly, which is a parliament. They didn't win, but those opposition parties began to signal that Turkey was moving in a more democratic direction. Truman was concerned especially about the situation in neighboring Greece. And in Greece, there was a civil war that had started in 1946, which pitted Western-aligned rebels against communist-aligned rebels that had sort of teamed up in order to expel the Nazis from Greece, but in the wake of freedom, we're now beginning to fight each other for control of the country. And so Truman was willing to provide financial assistance to the Greeks, and in the same tone and in the same moment, he was willing to provide financial assistance to the Turks in roughly the same amount. Eventually, Turkey would receive hundreds of millions of dollars in order to begin repairing their country. But in many ways, the Greek Civil War sort of opened the door to Truman's rapprochement with the Turks and the building of an alliance with the Americans. As we pointed out before, Turkey was solidly within the Western camp. And one of the things that we're going to see is that, unlike the rest of the Middle East, which is a lot more fluid, perhaps, in its associations. We've seen a lot of Middle Eastern countries in the Arab Cold War sort of shifting sides and being less clear about where they stand. Turkey is very much on part of the bulwark against communist expansion. There's a question of, did the Marshall Plan exclude Japan? Japan was funded by the United States, but it wasn't funded under the Marshall Plan. There were a number of other programs that were used to rebuild Japan. And as part of a new center preventing communist expansion, Turkey was asked to create a number of different alliances that would seek to hold back the Soviet Union. One of those alliances was to the northwest. In 1934, Atatürk had created a Balkans Pact to counter the aspirations of Bulgaria. And this time as well, he was able to bring most of the former members into a new Balkan Pact. İnönü was able to bring most of the former members into a new Balkan Pact, including Greece and the non-aligned Yugoslavia, which, despite being a communist country, was not in line with the Soviet Union. And even though the United States did not have good relations with Yugoslavia, Because of its relationship with Turkey, it was able to indirectly influence and become familiar with the situation in Yugoslavia. Another major alliance that it engaged with was to the southeast. In 1938, Atatürk had created the Sa'd-Abad Pact, which basically was a dead letter, but it had involved many of these countries, like Iran, Iraq, and in that case, Afghanistan. But the British, working with the Americans, created the Baghdad Pact, which would include Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and this time Pakistan, for restricting the influence of the Soviet Union. So we have this alliance, and finally, Turkey in 1949 decides to actually recognize the state of Israel. İnönü did this despite that it was popularly undesirable, but he wanted to demonstrate quite clearly that his relationship would be a Western-aligned relationship. And so he began an alliance with Israel and Iran that the Israelis have termed the alliance of the periphery, where these countries would work together to contain the Arabs. And in fact, the Turkish desire to contain the Arabs was such that throughout the 1950s, as we've seen, where Syria and Iraq take different anti-Western positions, Iraq after 1958 with Abdul Karim Qasim's revolution, and Syria in the earlier 1950s, wanted to invade those countries in order to put them under a stronger pro-Western leaning perspective. And it was the United States that actually told them to stand back. In the Syrian case, the Americans thought they would have one successful coup d'etat, which never ended up happening. And in the Iraqi case, the Americans felt that they could get rid of Abdul Karim Qasim through internal means, which, depending on how you see the coup of 1963, they may have done. There's a question on Afghanistan. Afghanistan was a member of the Sa'd-Abad Pact of 1938, but it wasn't a member of the Baghdad Pact in 1955. That's all I said about Afghanistan. Okay. Well, okay. So as we're getting to this democratic period, and İnönü wants to create a new party, we have a major problem, which is that there is no opposition party. Atatürk and İnönü in their one-state periods hadn't allowed for the flourishing of another party. So where were they going to get this other political party? Well, it turned out that in 1945, they created the situation that would precipitate the creation of a new political party. And that was the passage of the law for distribution of land to farmers and establishment of farmers' homesteads. And you can never blame the Turkish for having laws with names that are too short. So this law for land distribution, as a general matter, was designed to prevent a peasant uprising. As I mentioned before, although Turkey is increasingly urbanized, in 1945, 80% of the Turkish population is still rural, and they're not living in the major cities. So a major form of resentment that was occurring was that the poor population that had lived primarily as sharecroppers on larger, wealthier family land would get their own parcels of land if the land was divided. And many of the poor were in favor of these kinds of laws, but a number of the Kemalists were not. And these were Kemalists that were themselves owners of large tracts of land. Adnan Menderes, who you can see as second from the left in that picture of four standing gentlemen in the lower left-hand side, was a particularly large landholder, and he felt that this law would disinherit him. And so he became increasingly opposed to the general policies of the Kemalists, beginning with this law for land redistribution. And he and the other three issued what was called the Dörtlü Takrir, or the memo signed by four people. It's kind of hard to translate this term, but sort of the report signed by four people, which was the first real call in Turkey for the establishment of a new political party that they would lead in order to reform what was failing within the Kemalist circles. Now, originally, they weren't going to start a whole new party, but they were expelled for having written this note from the Kemalist political party. And that is when they began to create what was called the Democratic Party, and that was the party that ran against İnönü in 1946. The Democrat Party did relatively well, but it still didn't reach anything close to a majority until they came up with a new slogan in 1950, which was Yeter, söz milletindir, or enough, the word belongs to the people, meaning that the common people had been deprived of voice under the Kemalist government. The Kemalist government was ruling from a perspective of the benighted saviors. They weren't listening to public opinion. And in many cases, public opinion was opposed to the large-scale military expenditures that were going on and had been going on since the World War II period. Menderes as well was able to begin to open up the Democrat Party in many ways to the rural population. This was always going to be a pain point for the Kemalists, which is that their philosophy, because they were coming from the cities, because they were connected to the universities and the educated classes, they were always going to be governing from a minority of the public perception. Most Turks did not like necessarily all of the changes that Atatürk made. They may have been a little less interested in the secularism, a little less interested in the revolutionism, the power of the military, all of these kinds of things. And so it was very easy for Menderes to begin to appeal to the popular sentiment, especially on religious issues. Now, of course, he made it clear, and İnönü made it clear, that if the Democrat Party was going to be a legal party, that it would have to agree with the secularism of the Republic of Turkey. They couldn't change Turkey into a religious country. But of course, there were things that could be changed. There were restrictions that could be lessened. And that was where Menderes was able to make his biggest claim towards the rural populations that could vote for him. The other major thing which got him the financial backing that he needed in order to continue moving forward, and of course was right in line with his own interests, was an abandonment of devletçilik, of this state capitalist system. Menderes was interested in pursuing a more laissez-faire economic system with free enterprise. In many ways, the Republican Party of Turkey and the Democrat Party of Turkey can be understood as the opposites of the American Democrat and Republican Party. The Democrat Party in Turkey appeals to, generally speaking, the uneducated and more religious who live in the countryside, as well as the economically prosperous. And the Republican Party appeals to urbanized, relatively educated, and bureaucratic individuals. So, and the one strange point here, though, is that the army, because of its connection to Mustafa Kemal and its belief in the secular principles that he had promulgated, was strongly aligned with the Republican Party. But in 1950, the Democrat Party won 52% of the common vote, which was a landslide change in Turkish political history, because for the first time, the government was not controlled by the Republican Party. Now, something that we need to talk about in terms of what it did for Turkey is the Korean War. Now, by and large, when we've talked about Middle Eastern countries, the wars they've been involved with have almost exclusively been regional. Turkey is not in the same boat here. Turkey has the ability, as long as it is being supported by a more powerful ally, to expand militarily abroad. And in fact, Turkey is the second largest army in NATO today, which should give you a sense of the size of the Turkish military. The Turkish military was similarly large back then from a proportional perspective. Menderes was very much trying to convince the Western countries that Turkey belonged in NATO. NATO had already formed in 1949 and was primarily based in Western Europe. And there had been questions about whether Turkey could be involved in NATO or not, primarily aligned with the question of whether Turkey was a country truly embracing democratic norms and principles. The election of Menderes absolutely proved that Turkey had, to a certain degree, embraced democratic principles. This was a free and fair election. The opposition party won. All the forces around respected it. But in order for Turkey to be a member of a military alliance, in many cases, Turkey felt that the West had to see Turkey involved in a conflict in order to believe that it could achieve an effective role in that. And so what ends up happening is that when the United Nations is convened and the Americans discuss the possibility of creating a US-led United Nations peacekeeping force to liberate the Republic of Korea, the southern part of the Korean Peninsula, from the Democratic Republic of Korea, which is the northern part of the peninsula. Turkey was actually the second country after the United States to pledge its forces in alliance to free the South Koreans. And so the Turkish brigade was sent over under the command of General Tahsin Yazıcı. Yazıcı was a very famous general within Turkish circles. He had fought in the Turkish War of Independence and was very well decorated. There was one main problem, though, which is that he only spoke Turkish, which made it very difficult for him to coordinate and communicate with other parties. One of the ironies that naturally occurred because of this is that even though Greece joined Turkey and a number of other nations in the United Nations coalition, and Greece and Turkey at this point actually had fraternal relations, one of the things that both Atatürk and İnönü had cultivated was a strong relationship with the Greek presidents, especially Eleftherios Venizelos, such that when they were in Korea, they were actually relatively friendly with each other. They didn't actually serve in any of the same battles together. And of course, as the Americans were the dominant military force in the Korean War, most of the times that the Turkish forces saw action were in isolated incidents where Turks were either holding a small position or otherwise. One particularly famous battle was the Battle of the Turks called Kunuri. And this was where the American 8th Army was trying to escape from a Chinese attack. Now, for some context, starting in 1949, the Americans were able, once the Americans were involved in the Korean War in 1950, they were able to push back the North Korean forces almost up to the Yalu River, which is the border between China and North Korea. Now, because of this, the People's Republic of China became worried at the prospect of a United States military existing very close to their borders and decided to send the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, to North Korea. And in fact, the majority of the Korean War from late 1950 until the ceasefire in 1953 was Chinese forces fighting against the American-led coalition, and North Korean forces playing a very minor role in the following skirmishes. The Chinese were bearing down on the American 8th Army, and the Turkish forces of the Turkish Brigade were able to hold the ridge for a significant period of time before retreating. That's the Battle of Kunuri. And the Americans have always pointed out in letters and in statements how important it was that the Turks held the position, how effectively they did so, and their military courage in the Korean situation. For the Turks' part, they saw their contribution as the entry ticket to NATO. In fact, they got admitted to NATO in 1952. And they saw it as a legitimation of the economic and political successes that the Turks had had. But probably most importantly, this solidified the Turks as being anti-communist. Now they had fought the Chinese, they had held back the Russians with American help, and it firmly established their international political bona fides. And it complemented their Westernization. It showed that they were clearly on the political side of the West. One of the interesting things is that the Turkish contribution to Korea has probably stayed in Koreans' minds more effectively than it has in the minds of Turks. And one real showing of this was when there was the earthquake in Gaziantep earlier this year. Korea sent brigade workers and military soldiers to help in the recovery effort, going through the buildings and the rubble to help Turkish citizens that were negatively affected by the earthquake. And the Korean media began to put out this picture showing on the left a Turkish soldier comforting a young Korean boy who was suffering because of the Korean War and the destruction that it leveled on the peninsula. And on the right side, showing a modern Korean soldier giving the same sort of support and assurance to a young Turkish child in the ruins of Gaziantep. There's a question of, did our installation of missiles in Turkey have anything to do with these Turkish military cooperations? This was actually something that I was debating whether I should discuss or not. In the later 1950s and into the in the later 1950s, around 1958, 1959, the United States began talking to Turkey. This is after they had become a member of NATO, about putting Jupiter missiles throughout the country. And these talks were top secret at the time, and Turkey accepted. In fact, there became a bastion of missiles outside of the city of Izmir, directly targeted at the Soviet Union. And this became part of the American deterrence effort against the Soviet Union. Of course, from the American perspective, we are familiar with this situation because in 1962, the Soviets decided to retaliate by putting their own missiles in Cuba. And the way that Robert F. Kennedy, Secretary of State under John F. Kennedy, was able, President of the United States, was able to resolve this with his Russian counterparts was through the agreed removal of the missiles in Turkey as a way of counterbalancing the removal of the missiles in Cuba. So we then get to the 10 years of Democrat rule, because the Democrats were in power from 1950 until 1960, winning every election. And it shouldn't be surprising that they won the first few elections, especially in 1954. And there's a few reasons for that. The first was that Menderes was able to uphold his policy that he was going to increase a certain degree of religious liberty, which was something that the people in the rural areas cared about immensely. One of those things was the reinstallation of the Arabic adhan, that the mosque calls would no longer be given in Turkish, they'd be given in Arabic as had been traditionally done. And people saw this as a manifestation of Turkey returning to accepting Islam in a more cultural and political space. Probably more important for the farmers, though, was pure happenstance. the weather in Turkey from 1950 until 1954 was incredibly good for growing. And so Turkey had massive bumper crops, leading to the farming population becoming much more wealthier than they previously had been, and considering that the Democrat Party had implemented economic policies that were promoting the economy. And so from 1950 to 1954, you have a massive growth in the Turkish economy. You also have increasing numbers of people moving into the cities to try their hand in industry if farming was not necessarily what they were going for. We also have the Democrats trying to move in a direction away from Atatürk. Move away from İnönü, because İnönü was still the main rival of the Democrats. And the way that they did that was by turning to Atatürk. So İnönü had put his face on a lot of the currency throughout his rule in the 1930s and 1940s. So what did the Democrats do? They put Atatürk's face. And of course, nobody could argue that non-patriotic to put Atatürk's face. Of course, he had created the country. But in this way, the Democrats were able to make the currency less reflective of the current iteration of the Republican Party and able to make it reflective more of just general Turkish tradition and culture. The change in the Democrat Party really starts to occur in 1955, when the economy is not doing as well because the harvests are not as effective. Of course, people in the cities had already begun to dislike the Democrats because of their catering to the rural population, as opposed to the educated, and accordingly, universities became hotbeds of dissent. But that would increase as we move later into the decade. As I mentioned, the situation between Greece and Turkey had been relatively positive up through the Korean War and into the mid-1950s. Now, in order to do that, the two sides had consistently maintained negotiations and so on. What was going to be a massive political issue, though, was Cyprus. Cyprus, and we'll discuss more about the Cyprus situation soon, but Cyprus at this point is under British authority. And in fact, the British wouldn't give Cyprus independence until 1960 as a direct result of what we're talking about here. So the Greeks had gone to the United Nations and were seeking for a territorial redress with respect to Cyprus. That Cyprus be allowed to declare independence and that the United Nations oversee this. Now, the British did not want this going up to the UN Security Council, even though the British had a veto, because they didn't want the humiliation that would occur. Now, we need to remember that until 1956, the British saw themselves as an imperial country. They were the leaders of the empire. Now, it wouldn't be until 1956 with the Suez Crisis that the Americans would usurp that role and force the British to begin to seriously decolonize. Of course, that's why most of British Africa becomes independent in 1960. But during this period, the British still considered themselves an empire, and Cyprus is literally an unsinkable aircraft carrier. They have two major bases at Akrotiri and Dehelika, and those two bases are what the British seek to preserve through maintaining Cyprus as a colony. So there was an attack on a Greek institution in Salonika, a Turkish institution in Thessaloniki in Greece, and accordingly, the British were able to use this as a wedge issue in Turkey, telling the Turks to take a strong response against the Greeks on account of what had occurred in Thessaloniki in order to pressure them as well on the Cyprus issue. And so, believing that they would be supported by the British, the Democrats made that argument to Greece that they may consider revising the Lausanne Treaty if Greece allowed attacks on Muslim sites in Greece to continue. Now, the Lausanne Treaty had provided the rights for Greeks to worship freely within Turkey. And so the Greeks were surprised by this kind of bluster from Turkey, but they went along with it anyway. And that sort of negativity coming from the Turkish government sort of began to percolate among the population, leading to a pogrom against the Greek community of Istanbul on 6th and 7th of September 1955. Now, I have a great question here, which is that the 1955 pogrom led to the expulsion of many of the remaining Greeks from Turkey. It wasn't so much that they were expelled forcibly as that they left because they were afraid of what would continue to happen. There was no, the Turkish government didn't force them to leave. They left because the situation wasn't safe for them. Six to one half dozen to the other, but it's a slight difference. At about the same time, Nasser expelled the Greeks from Egypt. Do you know if there's any coordination in this effort between the DP and Nasser? What was the Democratic Party foreign policy vis-a-vis Arabic nationalism? The latter question is much easier to answer. The Democrat Party did not like Arab nationalists. Remember, the Democratic Party was on the Western side in the Cold War, and the Arab nationalists were overthrowing Western-aligned monarchs. They overthrew Farouk in Egypt, who the Turks were never terribly excited about. The Americans actually tried to foster a Turkish-Egyptian alliance. That went nowhere. But Farouk was clearly Western-aligned, whereas Nasser was one of the founders of the non-alignment group and later would become more and more pro-Soviet. So, and a lot of what we saw in Arab nationalism is that Arab nationalists were either ambivalent about the Western Cold War or they were actively pro-Soviet. So the Turks were not in favor of Arab nationalism. And as we pointed out before, the Turks actually wanted to contain Arab nationalism in Syria and in Iraq, and it was the Americans who told them to step back a little bit. In terms of the expulsion of Greeks from Egypt, the expulsion of Greeks from Egypt was part of the wider anti-colonialism process in Egypt, where Egypt targeted any non-Egyptian population as being traitors to the Republic. The Greeks and the Jews were targeted at the same time because the Greeks and the Jews were disproportionately wealthy. Greeks were involved primarily in shipping businesses. Jews were involved primarily in banking businesses. Nobody's surprised by either of those. But if we actually look at the economic ledgers in 1950 in Egypt, 40% of businesses that were registered to the Greek and Jewish communities combined, which together were about 4% of the population. So that should give you a sense of how economically ascendant these two populations were. And as part of his nationalization, Nasser was expropriating the territory from these populations to give to other Egyptians in order to increase his popularity, which was immense among the Egyptian population. So these are two Greek forcible relocations that occurred at the same time, but for fundamentally different reasons. There's a question, did this turmoil have anything to do with the mid-60s Greek coup, or is that completely unrelated? The mid-60s Greek coup is actually going to affect the Cyprus situation later, but it can affect the situation before in 1955. So we start moving into a period where you have a lot more dissent directed at the Democrat Party because of this increasing instability. The economic growth that had occurred in the first half of the 50s was not occurring in the second half of the 50s, so Democrat support was eroding, and you begin to have more and more resistance to their power. Naturally, as is wont to do, the Republican Party began to lead the campaign to reinstantiate themselves in power. And in the 1957 election, they came close, closer than they ever had been. The Democrat majority was significantly lessened in the Grand National Assembly, but the Republican Party did not win a majority. But they didn't want to stop trying, so İnönü continued to campaign in 1960 because Turkey has a requirement of 4 years maximum between elections. You can call an election at any time, but you need 4 years. But 4 years is the maximum between any two elections that you call. And so he began going to a number of different places. One of the places he wanted to go was Kayseri, and you can see him on the train to Kayseri, which was stopped by forces loyal to the Democrats at Yeşilhisar. This was seen as a violation of the democratic norms of Turkey, the increasing control of the population. And there were protests throughout the country, especially from the educated urbanized classes, the ones that tended to be more pro-Republican Party anyway. And they were arrested. This increasing crackdown led to İnönü actually issuing what effectively amounted to a threat that if the Democrat Party begins to violate more and more of the democratic norms that had been established, the military might take a negative attitude towards this. There's a question of, I'm not sure if it's a rumor, but my father told me that Atatürk lined up all the extremist religious leaders and had them killed in order to preserve Westernization of Turkey. Atatürk definitely rounded up religious leaders and executed them or expelled them. I don't know if he rounded up all of them or if he shot them one by one, like the comment asks, but yes, Atatürk definitely removed a large number of religious leaders from public life in order to promote his secularization. And the Democrat Party did not seem to be easing up even after İnönü's warning, which led to Alparslan Türkeş and Cemal Gürsel leading a military coup on the government and the removal of the Democrat Party from power. Now, the argument from Alparslan Türkeş, who was the one who came over the radio, was that the excesses of the Democrat Party were in violation of the democratic norms of the country, in violation of the secularism of the country, and therefore those individuals had to be removed from power. And you had what were called the Yasyada trials, which took place on Yasi Island. Yasyada, ada is the Turkish suffix for island. So they took place on that island later in the year, because the coup had occurred in May of 1960, and the trial started in October of 1960 and carried onwards. There are conflicting arguments about why the military stepped up. One was that they felt compelled by İsmet İnönü, with whom they had a strong loyalty. Another is that they saw the Democrat Party as being too anti-secular in its approach to religious topics. In fact, the Democrat Party had, while not violating the secular requirements of the Constitution, had repeatedly accused the Republican Party of being atheistic and anti-religious, which, of course, was negatively viewed in most of the rural population, which were themselves religious people and opposed to the art and to the strictness of the secularism that the Republican Party demanded. But perhaps the most important reason was that it was believed that the Democrat Party, in order to stay in power, had been looking for loans from the United States. And when those loans were not forthcoming, they were willing to entertain a discussion with Moscow, moving out of the pro-US NATO sphere and perhaps moving into a non-aligned position. In fact, the meeting was scheduled for later in 1960 in Moscow. So the military's intervention, perhaps, was to keep Turkey within NATO and to keep the relationship going with the United States, which had been a strong benefactor of Turkey. And you can see in the lower left-hand side the kinds of large protests that had occurred prior to the military coup against the Democrat Party, especially in urban centers. I believe this protest is one in Izmir, but there were protests in Izmir, Istanbul, and Ankara, among other cities. This was the first time that the military had ever taken direct power in Turkey. It would not be the last time. And Cemal Gürsel was in charge of coordinating the creation of a new constitution. That constitution would be promulgated in 1962. And so we'll get to that when we get to 1962. But let's take a second and begin to note that we're going to talk about some longer term themes that might be outside of the reign of any particular moment, but I'll start talking about these themes when they start becoming part of the political discussion in Turkey. So this starts in 1961, which is why I'm talking about it here. And this term Gastarbeiter is the German term for guest worker. And we should sort of be aware of what the German situation was and how the Turkish situation plays into that, starting after World War II. So after World War II, Germany came under occupation from the four major Allied powers operating in the European theater. That's the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union. And they divided Germany into four occupation zones. Now, the occupation zones controlled by the United States, United Kingdom, and France became united in what was called the Bundesrepublik Deutschland, or the Federal Republic of Germany, commonly known as West Germany, but it is the same government that rules Germany today, with the same official name, Bundesrepublik Deutschland, the Federal Republic of Germany. The Soviet-occupied zone became independent in 1948 as the German Democratic Republic, commonly known as East Germany. Now, both of these countries were suffering tremendously from the amount of destruction that World War II had wrought, both in terms of the physical damage. Significant parts of nearly every major German city were bombed, either traditionally bombed or firebombed. And a significant part of the German labor force had been sent to war and killed off. Millions of German men who otherwise would have been in Germany to help it rebuild no longer existed. And so what ends up happening here is that Germany needs a significant amount of the workforce to rebuild the country physically. So in 1955, West Germany inaugurates a Gastarbeiter program, which would see guest workers from nearby countries who could come to Germany and rebuild it. East Germany has a similar program, but that program doesn't involve Turkey because necessarily it's going to involve countries in the Soviet sphere. In fact, a significant number of the Gastarbeiter in East Germany come from nearby Slavic countries or Vietnam, for example. But in West Germany, the original targets were Italy and Spain, especially Italy, due to its proximity. And the thought was that these guest workers would come to Germany, and after coming to Germany, they would go home in 2 or 3 years after having contributed to the economy in some way. There were discussions about whether or not Turkey should be involved. Turkey had a large young population, but in 1955, the Germans were under the view that the Turkish culture would be too distinct, too different from the German culture, and that they would resist assimilation to a strong degree, meaning that the Turks should not be considered. But by 1961, the number of Italians and Spaniards who were beginning to come to Germany was insufficient for the massive reconstruction needs that Germany had. And so you began to have the entertaining of the idea of bringing Turkish guest workers in. And so in 1961, Cemal Gürsel, the military commander who was in control of the Republic of Turkey, signed an agreement with Germany, allowing Turkey to participate in the Gastarbeiter program. And so you end up seeing Gastarbeiter show up in Germany in its major cities, especially Hamburg, to a lesser extent in the first days because of its isolation physically, but later more in Berlin and some of the other German cities. Now, what ends up happening is that a lot of the guest workers that come to Germany are coming directly from the rural environment. So these are not the educated Turks that would support the Republican Party. These are the less educated, more rural Turks who would support the Democrat Party. And when they came to Germany, they were impressed by the degree of development that Germany had, the presence of hospitals and good healthcare, the presence of effective schools, modern paved roads, all of these kinds of things. And they integrated into Germany relatively well from a economic perspective. From a religious perspective, it was a little bit more difficult for them. And their society remained relatively separate from German society overall. Germany, from a legalistic point of view, continued to see the Gastarbeiter program as being a temporary residence program. But in 1964, they began to recognize that some of the Gastarbeiter were going to stay longer and that their terms should be extended. And throughout the later 1960s and early 1970s, you begin to have family relocation programs that allowed the men who had come to Turkey to bring over their wives and children and begin to establish a life in Germany, despite the fact that they couldn't become citizens of West Germany. Within Turkish society in Germany throughout the 1960s, you begin to have an explosion of wealth. And that explosion of wealth resulted in an incredible development of a music and artistic culture that ended up going back to Turkey as well, with many of the artists publishing in Turkish in Germany, and those records going to Turkey, and Turkish music then coming to the Turkish community in Germany. Today, the Turkish community in Germany is about 3 million people. At that time, it was about half of that, but that's still a significant community of people who are involved in this scene. And one of the interesting things is that music begins to become a political voice for the German Turkish community. One particular story that I want to highlight is that of Cem Karaca, who you can see on the right-hand side. Karaca was incredibly famous in both Turkey and in Germany. He lived most of his life in Germany, and in fact had said a number of different things about the government, criticizing it and so on, that he was persona non grata in Turkey for nearly 15 years, living a significant part of his life in Germany. But in this vein, he also made music that represented Turkish lifestyle and Turkish ideals, and struggles within Germany of the inability of the Turks to properly assimilate. One of the changes is that in 1983, the Turkish government approved what was called the repatriation law, and 200,000 German Turks returned to Turkey with their families. But 200,000 is a small cry from the over a million German Turks that there already were. And by this point, in the 1980s, you already had new families that were developing. The population was equalizing in terms of genders, right? Because these are Turkish families born on German soil. And because Turkish law permits jus sanguinis types of citizenship, most of those people living in Germany as Gastarbeiter were, and their children, were Turkish citizens, not German citizens. And they voted in Turkish elections. But as Germany began to liberalize its laws in the 1990s concerning the acquisition of German citizenship, we begin to see a voting culture develop within the German Turks. And it's a very interesting one. They tend to vote for a conservative party in Turkey, be it the Demokrat Party, some of its successors like the Justice Party, and now currently the Justice the AKP, the Justice and Freedom Party, I believe, which is Erdogan's party. But in German elections, they tend to vote for left-wing parties. Originally, they were primarily voting for the Social Democrats, the SPD, because the Social Democrats were protecting the labor unions, and also they were the ones pushing for better immigration policy. But eventually, this expanded to the Greens. And now it has even expanded into the CDU, the Christian Democratic Union, which is Germany's right-wing party. But still, within the German political sphere, to the extent that Turks are represented, they're overwhelmingly represented in left-wing parties. Probably the most famous of these is Cem Özdemir, who was born in Germany, and has been a representative in the German parliament, the Bundestag, for Bundestag, sorry, for God, over 20 years. He is a member of the Green Party and has taken many positions contrary to the government in Turkey, holding that from a German perspective, those positions don't make sense. Turkey should have more freedoms and democracy, more freedoms than it currently has. He disagrees with the Turkish position on the Cypriot issue. He also disagrees with the Turkish position on the Armenian issue. In fact, he was one of the leading individuals calling for Germany to recognize the Armenian genocide in 2016, despite the fact that his family has no Armenian heritage and exclusively Turkish heritage. He has also advocated for a number of different proposals on Germany's power network and grid, and has led the Green Party in several different stints throughout his life. Other examples of positive Turkish integration into Germany are the story of Uğur Şahin and Özlem Türeci. That's a husband and wife team that founded a pharmaceutical company called BioNTech. BioNTech was responsible for partnering with Pfizer during the coronavirus epidemic, coronavirus outbreak in 2020, and creating the Pfizer vaccine that was delivered primarily to individuals in the Western world. Of course, these positive contributions should also be balanced out by the negative contributions. Following the Solingen arson attack, which was an arson attack by neo-Nazis against Turkish Gastarbeiter in Germany in May of 1993, the Turkish population became more and more incensed by the fact that they couldn't integrate as effectively as they would like within the German context. And they felt that a significant part of this comes from German resistance to seeing them as part of the German world. They've pointed out, for example, that at the same time, many individuals from the former Soviet Union were moving to Germany, and they had an easier time acquiring citizenship in Germany, especially if they were of Jewish ancestry, than they did. And so you began to see a number of riots from the Turkish community in Germany, and you began to see more and more resistance by Turks to the popular forms of integration, such as going to schools, such as working, and so on, leading to the Turkish community in Germany being featured more highly in criminal statistics and lower education statistics than other populations in Germany. So you have this weird interplay because the German-Turkish voters are voting for these left-wing parties, which criticize the Turkish government, but they also vote in Turkish elections and vote for those parties that the politicians that they elect in Germany are criticizing. So what's sort of the connective tissue? Why would they vote for the parties in Turkey that the parties that they're voting for in Germany are criticizing? And it goes back to what they were enamored with Germany in the first place. They were enamored with how modern it was, the developed education system, developed healthcare system, the roads, and so on. And a lot of the parties that are more right-leaning in Turkey, such as the Demokrat Party, the Justice Party, the AKP, were parties that tried to build that kind of infrastructure in Turkey. And so in many ways, they see it as their way of giving to Turkey what they wish Turkey had had when they had left as Gastarbeiter. So now Cemal Gürsel wanted to transition to democracy. And so he created and led the promulgation of the 1961 Constitution. Now, this was a unique constitution in Turkish history in that it gave a significant amount of autonomy to the different apparatuses of the state, such that power wasn't concentrated in any of the four parts. The first one, of course, was the Grand National Assembly, which was the traditional source of power. Turkey was a parliamentary democracy and would remain so, meaning that the president, even though there is a president, is a largely ceremonial role, charged with choosing the prime minister, but the prime minister assembles his coalition and so on. And power had been concentrated in the Grand National Assembly and its prime minister since the democratic elections in 1946. But there were three other entities that would be outside of the power for the first time of the Grand National Assembly, and that would be the Supreme Court, which would have its own, you would have an independent judiciary as its own function. You would have the state radio and media and the universities, all these centers of education and promulgation that would be outside of the control of the Grand National Assembly, meaning that they could report freely and critically of government institutions. And the fourth one is that the military would be outside of the control of the Grand National Assembly. The military now saw its role as implementing the İnkılapçılık, the revolutionism of Atatürk's 6 arrows. And they would make sure that if the Turkish Republic was going away from its necessary course of Kemalism, that they would bring it back into alignment. Now, Cemal Gürsel and other generals like Sunay felt that İsmet İnönü, the leader of the Republican Party, would be the kind of person who could lead a normalization. And if he were the candidates that would prevail in the Grand National Assembly, they could return the country to democracy. There were those, however, in the military cadres who disagreed, like Talat Aydemir. And so in 1962, he launched a coup. In February of 1962, he launched a coup against İnönü's government and tried to take power in Ankara. However, most of the military stayed with İnönü, and İnönü was actually able to send correspondence back and forth to Talat Aydemir in order to get him to stop the coup. And part of that agreement was that all the members of the coup would be given political amnesty. They wouldn't be tried for the crime of trying to overthrow the government, but at the same time, they would back down and go back to their military barracks. And that's exactly what happened. Aydemir himself was not convinced that the democratic solution would survive and tried another coup in 1963, for which İnönü was a little bit less willing to forgive him, and he was executed later that year. From a functional perspective, the new situation in Turkey, which allowed for multiple different sources of power, created a set of checks and balances. And so the 1961 Constitution did what created the exact opposite situation has had occurred during the one-party period of Atatürk and İnönü. You had so many different sources of power that you began to have conflicts between those sources of power. So we enter this sort of chaotic period in the 1960s where new ideas are beginning to proliferate because of how many different centers of power there are. The first one is that we see the beginning of the political career of Süleyman Demirel, who begins to form a new political party, the Justice Party. And the Justice Party, in many ways, is the remnant of the Demokrat Party, which survived the Yassıada trials. Right, Menderes, of course, was executed, but other individuals were not. There's a question of whether the 1961 Constitution is akin to the three branches of the US government to include the fourth estate. I would say that it's similar in that you have a separation of powers, and those powers have checks on the other powers, but in every other way, and one other way is that the judiciary is independent of the legislature. But we should bear in mind that in Turkey, there is a fusion of the legislative and the executive powers, which does not exist in the United States, right? The legislative and executive powers in the United States are based in the Congress and the president separately, whereas the prime minister in Turkey is in control of both in the Second Republic. And we should notice that the military is not answerable to a civilian leader, whereas in the United States, the US president, the chief executive, is the commander-in-chief and has direct control over the military apparatus. Finally, media in the United States is not an independent authority that exists outside of government. Government can make laws about the media like they can any other industry. So it's actually very different than the constitutional setup in the United States. And I would say within a Turkish context, you needed that protection more because the freedom of speech is not as enshrined in Turkey as it is in the United States. So you have the situation where the Justice Party is now beginning to win elections in 1965. And the reason that Süleyman Demirel is able to achieve such a success is because he returns to the electoral base that the Democrats had used, which is that rural community. Now, the rural population was decreasing. A lot of them were moving into the cities. But even when they moved into the cities, they were still going to vote along rural lines. They were still going to vote for parties that would support the same kinds of economic and political conditions as they had in the countryside, because they were having difficulty assimilating into the cities. In fact, a lot of them were becoming part of the industrial machinery in those cities, as opposed to becoming relatively educated. And in particular, he managed to appeal to a lot of the rural voters because of his accent. He came from a small village, and while he spoke Istanbul Turkish, he spoke it with an accent from that village, which endeared him in the way that a localized accent does to people who are outside of the main halls of power. And you can see from the image below that Demirel was in and out of power at numerous points during the 1960s and 70s. And his involvement in politics contrasts with that of Bülent Ecevit, who was the successor to İnönü in certain respects in the Republican Party. Ecevit and his philosophy was to pull the Republican Party further to the left, to make it a social democratic party like the SPD in Germany or something similar. Now, İnönü wanted to stay still at the center. He didn't want to move as far left as that. But it made more sense to try and capture the left because Süleyman Demirel was quite strongly to the right in the sort of a conservative laissez-faire economic sense. But their two views were not the only views that existed in Turkey. In fact, we have a left-wing shift within a significant part of the population, both the youth within the cities and the industrial workers in the cities who tend to move to the left. From the side of the younger individuals in the cities, you have, for example, the Fikir Kulüpleri Federasyonu, or the debate societies, for want of a better term. And these federations, or federasyonu, were designed to promote the dissemination of other political ideas, especially ideas on the left. And this resulted in the creation of the Devrimi Gençlik, or the Revolutionary Youth, which began to advocate for an increasing shift away from the United States and from the Western powers, and towards something a little bit more non-aligned, or perhaps even Soviet-aligned. There was a massive inequality between those who were wealthy under the 10 years of Democrat rule and military rule, and that some of that wealth should return back to the population, especially as Turkey was more and more effective economically. The other group, of course, that was pushing more to the left were the industrial workers, who began to advocate for labor unions. Now, one of Menderes's original claims when he came to power in 1950 is that he would allow labor unions, which had been disallowed during İnönü's period, and he had reneged on this. Labor unions were still illegal as of the 1960s, and so industrial workers kept pushing for a change in the law that would allow unions to be able to be formed. And to a small extent, Demirel conceded on this, but by and large, they wanted to form left-leaning organizations in order to push for more movement on that front. Of course, the right wing also was heavily involved in agitation as well. So Alparslan Türkeş, who we remember as being the person who advocated, who was the person who announced on the radio that the coup of 1960 had happened. This was an individual who began to see the increasing accommodation of the left, the increasing accommodation of non-Kemalist parties to be injurious to the health of Turkey. And so he began in 1968 to form an organization called the Grey Wolves, or Bozkurtlar. And the Bozkurtlar or the Grey Wolves, were based on this Turanist idea, right, that we've talked about before with Nihal Atsız, that the Turks are themselves the descendants of the wolves, and they should protect their country and their ethnic identity through the same method as the wolf, through aggression and power. And so we see his organization, along with other ultranationalist organizations at the time, perpetrate Bloody Sunday on the 16th of February 1969, or Kanlı Pazar, Bloody Sunday, where they attacked left-wing protesters. And you begin to have situations where thousands of people die across Turkey in fights between extreme left-wing organizations and extreme right-wing organizations. And in fact, the political coalitions that Süleyman Demirel is able to put together at certain points fall apart as individuals defect or want to take a different side on a different issue, right? If we remember from the previous slide, he had different governments even in quick succession because he wasn't able to hold on to the coalition without it falling apart or fissioning because of the economic situation that was occurring in the end of the 1960s as well. So you have this violence on the streets. You have the situation where, for example, left-wingers are protesting increasing American involvement in Turkey, right? The Americans are anchoring the Sixth Fleet off the Turkish coast and in Turkish ports, which the left is opposed to. But the bigger issue is, of course, that the economy is failing. And the economy is failing because at a certain point, the lira starts becoming devalued relative to foreign currencies. But in order to maintain an easier time for internal industry, what Demirel decides to do is create an artificial peg. So he makes the lira more expensive than it should be, meaning that a dollar, or to buy anything on the foreign market, is cheaper than it otherwise would be for Turkish producers. And that allowed Turkish industry to develop an internal economy that was very successful and kept out external products. But what this meant was that there was a growing black market for dollars that would be traded at the actual rate of exchange, which was 5 times lower than the peg. And so you create all this black market for Western goods, and especially as Turkey begins to become more and more modernized, many of its citizens want those Western goods. They want access to those kinds of technologies. It creates a fundamental imbalance in the population, and the military wants to assert itself in order to prevent a collapse of the democratic order. So they send a memorandum on the 12th of March in 1971, basically telling Demirel to get his act together or they will overthrow him. And so Demirel resigns from the government in 1971, but he's called back in order to form a new coalition. And this creates a weird sense of friction between the military and Demirel. And that weird sense of friction is primarily because the military sees themselves as the guarantors of Kemalism and the guarantors of the democracy, but the democracy has to stay within the bounds of Kemalism in order to be acceptable. But at the same time, unless the military wants to actually rule the country as a military dictatorship, which they don't want to do because of the commitment to democracy and republicanism, they can't just send memorandums every time they don't like the government. And so there's this uneasy relationship that begins to develop between the military and the wider government. During this period, we should also talk about the growth of Islamism within Turkey. So we've talked about the left wing and those who are more communist aligned. We've talked about the right wing and those who are ultra-nationalist. There's a third way that starts to really develop during the 1960s, led by a politician, Necmettin Erbakan. And Erbakan's view is that there should be a reversal of the laicism. And in fact, he creates a number of different political parties including the National Salvation Front within Turkey, and it's called Milli Görüş outside of Turkey, which deny Turkey the right to live as a secular republic. If you look at the Oath of Milli Görüş, for example, the last line, victory is for the believers and victory is near, this is referring to the idea that the believers will create a religious state, and that religious state will be different from the current political entity. Now, Erbakan, throughout his political career, formed no less than 6 different political parties, each of them being banned in turn because of its violation of the laiklik or secularism principle. But this is one of those cases where the Turkish diaspora and Turkey have an interconnected relationship. And so while Erbakanism and Milli Görüş were effectively banned as philosophies within Turkey throughout the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, they had a resurgence outside of Turkey in the creation of Milli Görüş institutes outside of Turkey, with the Gastarbeiter in Germany and with the similar Turkish expats in the Netherlands and to a lesser degree France. And so you have the Islamic communities beginning to develop based on this idea of Islamic modernism that we've discussed before, but that you should have Islamic influence in the state and in the state structures, and that Islam should be a part of the governing apparatus of a Turkish state. Because the spiritual strength of Turks comes from Islam, and through that spiritual strength, they will have political strength and ascendancy. And so in Turkey, the way that this tends to develop, in addition to those banned political parties that keep coming back, you have large welfare groups that exist in the rural areas that work with those more religious communities. And you also have the beginning of paramilitaries that develop that are more Islamist in nature as well. So you begin to have this interaction between the ultra-left, the ultra-right, and the ultra-Islamist taking place on the Turkish street, not in a free and open debate, but in an actual violent struggle, especially as you get towards the late 60s, before the memorandum, and, before the late 70s, in the late 70s, when you have the second coup to resolve that problem. The next major issue, sort of as a thematic issue, that we should talk about is Cyprus. Now, we've mentioned Cyprus before when we talked about the Istanbul Program in 1955. But since that point, you have the situation on Cyprus develop. So in 1960, Cyprus is able to get independence and is led by the Greek patriarch Makarios III, with a constitution that guarantees a certain set of rights to the Turkish minority. The Turkish minority that counts as about 18% of the Cypriot population is granted 30% of the seats in the parliament. They're also granted the vice presidency with a veto. So the president and the vice president both have a veto on any legislation that comes out of the parliament. But this doesn't resolve all of the ethnic strife that exists on the island. And for clarity, both the Greek Cypriots and the Turkish Cypriots are themselves inhabitants of the island of Cyprus, who are either Greek speakers or Turkish speakers, and are not descendants of people who came from Greece or who came from Turkey at some prior point. They are indigenous Cypriots. And in Cyprus, similar to how we've talked about in Turkey, how there was violence in the public square, there was violence in the public square in Cyprus. The difference, of course, being that violence in Cyprus was ethnic. And so there were a number of egregious attacks by Greeks against Turks and Greek Cypriots against Turkish Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots against Greek Cypriots. One particular attack against Turkish Cypriots that was particularly violent was called Kanlı Noel, or Bloody Christmas, which occurred in 20th to 21st December of 1963. Over 340 Turkish Cypriots were killed. Around half that number of Greek Cypriots were also killed. And over 25,000 Turkish Cypriots, which is about a quarter of the total Turkish Cypriot population at that time, fled for their lives from the area of the attack. And this became increasingly bothersome to the Turkish population in Turkey. Now, Turkey had been granted certain rights under the Cypriot constitution. When Cyprus became independent, the British, the Greeks, and the Turkish governments were entitled to be the protectors of the Cypriot situation. And so Turkey saw itself as the guarantor for the Turkish Cypriot population. And you can see on the map that the Turkish Cypriot population is sort of dispersed throughout a number of the major cities of Cyprus, and the Greeks are primarily located in the rural areas as well as in the major cities. And those red areas are the British military bases that they retained even with Cypriot independence. So the Turks began to agitate more and more that they wanted to engage in what was called Taksim, and this or division of the island between a Turkish part and a Greek part, whereas the Greeks considered the whole island of Cyprus unique and indivisible, and that they had already given significant accommodations to the Turks. In fact, if anything, those accommodations should be rolled back so that the Turks are represented in the population that they are. So, as we move through the 1960s, you have a number of radical groups that develop on the island of Cyprus called AOKA. First, there's AOKA A, and then AOKA B comes later. And these groups are proposing enosis. They based on the idea that Cyprus, because it is a Greek country, should become part of Greece. And this is not without precedent. Crete performed the act of enosis in 1909, which is how it became part of Greece as well, because Crete used to be an independent country after it had revolted against the Ottomans. Now, the Turkish Cypriots were absolutely opposed to this. So was the country of Turkey, because they believed that within the country of Greece, that those Turks would not have their rights respected. And so the Turkish view on this became increasingly demanding that Taksim should be implemented or some other resolution to the Turkish Cypriot problem. But in 1974, there was a military coup in Greece, and that military coup in Greece inspired the Greeks to send their own military attachés, which were based in Cyprus, because remember, Greece was also a guarantor of Cypriot independence. So there were military groups based close to Cyprus to overthrow the government of Makarios III, who was opposed to enosis, even though a significant part of the Greek population was in favor of it, with Nikos Samson, who was a member of AOKA B and therefore would be in favor of creating enosis, or a union with Greece. And so Turkey saw its moment to act both in furtherance of the Taksim goal that it had, as well as to protect the Turkish Cypriot citizens who would be disadvantaged through the act of enosis. And so on the 20th of July, 5 days after the coup, Turkish troops made landfall on the northern part of Cyprus and began to march down the country towards the capital of Nicosia. And so after 5 days, Turkey is able to consolidate most of the northern part of the country, and a ceasefire is reached. And so you end up with a divided Cyprus. If you look at the divided map, the areas in green are those controlled by the Turkish government. At the moment of the ceasefire, the areas in red are those controlled by the Cypriot government of Makarios III, who was able to resume power, and Nikos Samson was ejected. Was ejected. Later, the government would be transferred to Klerides, for those who follow the situation a little bit more closely. Yeah, the Greek junta fell in July, but there's a comment that the Greek junta fell in July of 1974, which is correct. But they had already set in motion the junta in Cyprus, so that's why the Cyprus junta happened that late. But so the Makarios Klerides government controlled that red portion, and of course the UK facilities are the same. And there was a UN ceasefire line that ran across the entirety of the island that kept the Greek south from the Turkish north. And the Turkish government used its military power to compel the Greeks of the north, especially from the city of Famagusta, to migrate towards the south. And they also used military power to compel Turks in the south to try and move to the north, so that these two enclaves would become religiously unique. There were a number of different brutal actions by both Turkish soldiers and from Greek Cypriot soldiers against individuals of the rival ethnic group. And some of these include violent massacres of civilians. Some of these included non-consensual sexual relations. And those were of such a number and to such an extent that Cyprus, a deeply conservative Christian country, permitted abortion in 1974 to deal with the outcome of these non-consensual sexual encounters. You had large-scale razing of villages, and there are other human rights issues that occurred for Greeks who were not expelled during the 5 days of war, such as the Greeks on the peninsula of Rizzocarpasso, which is in the northern part of Cyprus. But since it wasn't taken by Turkish military soldiers at the time of the ceasefire, the Greeks were actually still there. And there's still a Greek community of under 1,000 people in Rizzocarpasso, but they are increasingly prevented from teaching their kids in Greek. And many of them are fleeing to the southern part of Cyprus anyway. So now the last piece that's worth pointing out is that there was no connection really between the north and the south for quite a while. In 1983, the Turkish part declared independence under Rauf Denktash, who was one of the former vice presidents of United Cyprus. He became the president of the Turkish Republic of North Cyprus. But no international entity recognizes the Turkish Republic of North Cyprus as independent, except for the Turkish government itself. Most see it as an appendage of the Turkish government, and it is defended by Turkish soldiers. It uses the Turkish lira as its currency. So from an administrative perspective, it is functionally Turkish. And you can see that they've even carved into Mount Pendaktilos, which is on the northern side of the city of Nicosia. So it's within full view of South Cyprus. They've carved a picture of the the Turkish Republic of North Cyprus flag, as well as that sentence, Nimir Türk'üm diyene, happy is he who says he is a Turk, right? That symbol of Turkish nationalism and power. And furthermore, to solidify the control of the north, the Turkish government began to talk to the muhtar, or the local mayors in rural Anatolia, to get Turkish populations to move to northern Cyprus. And so 200,000 rural Anatolians were taken and brought to northern Cyprus, shipped in order to Turkify the region. This is, of course, very similar in a lot of respects to the situation of the Moroccans in Western Sahara, where Moroccans were encouraged to move into Western Sahara, or the situation in Israel, where Jews are encouraged to move to the West Bank in order to form settlements, in each case to further create ethnic situations on the ground. And to put into perspective, the entire population of the island of Cyprus is around 1.6 million people. So 200,000 Turkish immigrants fundamentally changed the situation. There were negotiations in the early 2000s, which began to create a rapport between the Turkish Republic in the north and independent Cyprus in the south, resulting in the creation of border crossings, especially in the city of Nicosia, which is the world's only divided capital city de facto. Right, Jerusalem is a divided capital city de jure, but Nicosia is divided de facto. And so since 2003, people have been able to move between the two halves of Cyprus relatively easily. And when Cyprus became a member of the European Union in 2004, North Cyprus citizens can go to South Cyprus because South Cyprus, the government of the southern part of Cyprus, recognizes itself as the authority of all of Cyprus and considers all the people of the Turkish Republic of North Cyprus who are not themselves Anatolian Turks to be citizens of Cyprus, and they can get an EU passport, the Cyprus passport, which many of them want as opposed to the Turkish passport. So I think that puts us at time for tonight. So we'll get to the rest of this next week, as well as talking about the Third Republic. So questions, comments, clarifications, please put those in the chat. And while we're waiting for those to filter in, this is History Mostly Ancient Discussions. I am Richard. This is Wednesday, and we will finish our discussion of Turkey tomorrow night. Next week. And then we will discuss a variety of other thoughts. As I said towards the beginning of this presentation, I'm debating what I want to talk about. My thoughts at the moment are to talk about Afghanistan, the Caucasus after the fall of the Soviet Union, and the Gulf region as 3 different episodes, my final 3 episodes. But if you guys have other episodes that you are interested in, let me know. And perhaps I'll reconsider on one of those 3. Such as talking about Algeria, Libya, Yemen, so on and so forth. We have Asian philosophy with Jason. We have European Union security that Aaron and I will return to at some point. We have Powerful Women in Dead Languages coming up this month. We have Greco-Roman civilization that comes on periodically. And of course, we have our short-run series, like our series on the Russo-Ukrainian War, where we'll probably have an update sometime in later August. And we have our older series that you can see up on our YouTube page. So I have Sophia. You mentioned that you'd want to ask a question. So,
hello, can you hear me?
we can hear you.
Okay.
So you can turn on your camera if you like.
Okay, I'm trying to start it. It says the host has disabled it.
Oh, let me see.
No worries if you can't disable it. So I was essentially going to say that, first of all, thank you for your presentations. Since I've joined last year, I've learned a lot. I'm Afghan American and I'm a Sufi, and I look at the world futuristically as well. So I'm glad that you're covering the graveyard of empires, which is Afghanistan. And in terms of MENA in the world, now we have ChatGPT, we have Midjourney and AI tools. And I'm just wondering how we will change our professions, change our outlooks, and how just the global world will look with regards to the 192 countries. My personal opinion is I don't think America can be an empire again, maybe a republic, or based off our legal documents, just some kind of democracy that could bring back values of Socrates and Plato and other philosophers in the Middle East region. Yeah, that was just what I was going to say. So thank you again. I've really appreciated these lectures and learned a lot.
No, I think you bring up a very important point, which is that America's sort of in a soul-searching phase, and we've been there since the fall of the Soviet Union. We thought in the 1990s that the mission of America was going to democratize the world. That was sort of going to be the mission of the 90s. That was the war in Serbia, right? We were fighting to allow the Bosnians to have independence and choose democracy. We were going to all these different things. When we went into Iraq in 2003 was sort of the death of that, right? You had the height of neoconservatism, which was this idea of we will create a democratic empire, and then it turns out it's a lot more work than we thought. And we didn't plan adequately for it, and we didn't organize for it. And the American population is not interested in fighting a 40-year war to maintain an empire, the way that the British population was willing to allow it for 200 years. So I have my own personal feelings about it, but I think from a functional perspective, the United States cannot be an empire. Because the American population is not interested in that possibility. And I agree with Peter Zion on this, that the likely direction of the United States to go is regional, in that it will withdraw from significant portions of the world in a meaningful way, and the world will become much more multipolar. I'm not terribly excited by that prospect. I think that that will allow a number of dictatorial regimes to become more prominent and be able to impact more areas of the world. But that said, that seems to be the direction that most Americans want to go. Most Americans want to have a democracy that is contained to the United States, perhaps to Western Europe. Maybe we have a few allies in the Pacific Ocean, like Japan or Taiwan. But beyond that, Americans are not interested in certainly reshaping the Middle East anymore. So the Middle East will be perhaps part of the Eurasian situation that I discussed during the Iran presentation, right? Iran wants to be part of this Eurasian sort of alliance of Russia and China, as fractious as that is. Maybe that will be the future for the Middle East. Maybe the future for the Middle East is a new sort of assembled alliance of quasi-democracies, right? Sort of Israel, Turkey, Egypt, trying to promote Lebanon, maybe trying to promote that. Lebanon, if it's ruled by Samir Jaja and people who are along his sort of anti-Syrian coalition. To try and push back the sort of more dictatorial aspect. I don't know. It doesn't look particularly good for the Middle East trajectory at this point. I'm not particularly hopeful that Western values of human rights and liberal democracy are going to be the future for that region. There's a point here that the shift to an all-volunteer army was kind of a tip-off. No, I don't think with an all-volunteer army that we're actually in a position where we can't have an empire. I think that the fundamental reason that the United States can't have an empire is that Americans don't want to fight in foreign wars on foreign soil. And that's an entirely reasonable position for Americans to take, but it means that those countries can't rely on America as a security guarantor. And if they can't rely on America as a security guarantor, they might rely on somebody else, and that country will have its own prescriptions or non-prescriptions for domestic policy. All right, there were some other questions here that I didn't get to because I didn't think that they were directly connected. There's a comment here that the Soviets were unsuccessful in Cuba because of mediocre maps and geography. They underestimated the terrain and how palm trees would cover the missiles. But yes, the functional point of the Cuban missiles was not to actually launch them at America. The functional was a deterrent as part of the mutually assured destruction. I don't think Khrushchev actually intended to strike at the United States. So, there's a question of, did the German programs like Gastarbeiter have anything to do with Oppenheimer and the Nazis, like Operation Paperclip? No, those are completely different things. Operation Paperclip, well, first of all, Oppenheimer is American. He's not German. He's of German ancestry, but he's not German. So he never had to be gotten from Germany. In terms of Operation Paperclip, that was done to bring former Nazi scientists to the United States. These were high-level officials, and these were officials with knowledge that the United States felt they could use in the Cold War against the Soviet Union. These were people like Wernher von Braun, who was a rocket scientist and one of the principal leaders in the early days of NASA. So you have he was involved in the V2 rocket project in Nazi Germany. But these are high-level individuals. We're talking about several dozen people. We're not talking about the tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people that Germany needed to literally rebuild the country. So it was a very different operation. And unlike Operation Paperclip, which was a CIA operation and kept clandestine for decades, the Gastarbeiter program was publicly known. It was part of international relations between Germany and Italy first, and then Spain and several other European countries. There's a question of, is Hans Zimmer German? I don't know. If somebody can answer in the comments, that would be appreciated. Let's see. I think that covers all the questions that have been asked. Does anybody have anything else they'd like to ask, or any curiosities on what we've been discussing, or about the Middle Eastern politics more generally? All right, then. Considering there are no additional questions, we'll take this up next week and discuss the situation in Turkey up till the present day. All right. See everybody at that time. All right. Bye.